In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Mayuri and Nemu continue to fight Pernida, Nemu's past is revealed, and Mayuri at last destroys the Sternritter, but at what cost? After last week's incredible showdown between Kyoraku and Leal, ending with the spectacular reveal of Kyoraku's bankai, episode 36 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc had a lot to live up to. I've said it before that the battle between Mayuri and Pernida really heats up in the second half, so while expectations were high, I went into this episode fairly optimistic. Not only was Pernida going to triumphantly return, but Mayuri and Nemu were going to showcase some true teamwork, the Shinigami finally feeling the pressure as they enacted the mad scientist schemes in the face of the overwhelming power of the left arm of the Soul King. It promised to be a pretty good time, but I couldn't have imagined just how well the anime would nail this battle's particularly challenging finale, channeling action and emotion into one hell of an episode. Once again, this is a very faithful adaptation pretty much from start to finish, although not quite. There really isn't much being changed currently save for the ending, which was a very exciting new addition to say the least. It's funny, for myself, and I'm sure many of you, while we adore these more faithful episodes for a while now, really since the beginning, there's no denying the most anticipated parts of the anime are those totally new segments. It's just so crazy to me when a scene pops up and I don't have a clue what's going to happen. The ending of this week's episode, featuring the full-scale return of the Bambis, adds a lot to their little subplot in my opinion, and of course we'll dive into that towards the end of the spoiler analysis, but suffice it to say, that scene was a very welcome surprise in the closing minutes of the episode. Returning to the bulk of this week's story though, the second half of Mayuri and Nemu vs Pernida was brought to life exceptionally well, with the anime adding extra weight to some of the more poignant scenes in ways only this medium can. So as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, episode 36, Baby Hold Your Hand 2, Never Ending My Dream. As always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. However, before we get started on today's video, if by the end of it you enjoyed this review and you want to see more from me and you're not yet subscribed to the channel, then please consider doing so today in order to stay up to date. It really does help out the channel, and I greatly appreciate the support on our journey to 300,000 subs. Let's begin the review then, and as always, we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. The pacing felt considerably better here when compared with the first half of the battle a couple of weeks ago. Mayuri is humbled by Pernida on numerous occasions, forcing him onto the back foot and therefore forcing him into action. Despite being a Mayuri-centric fight, this doesn't feel like his typical affair at all. Instead, this episode really zeroes in on what made this battle feel so special in the manga, that true sense of desperation against insurmountable odds. As a result, the episode feels faster, more frenetic, and unpredictable, and less about Mayuri's monologues. But without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 36. Firstly, we have Chapter 630, The Twinned Twilight. Chapter 640, Baby Hold Your Hand 3, Mad Lullaby number 7. Chapter 641, Baby Hold Your Hand 4, When I Am Sleeping. Chapter 642, Baby Hold Your Hand 5, Eyes Are Open. Chapter 643, Baby Hold Your Hand 6, Waiting for Love. And finally, Chapter 644, Baby Hold Your Hand 7, Never Ending My Dream. Of course, the chapters here all make total sense for this episode. Once again, we are mostly enjoying a straight sequence of events. Of course, we have doubled back on ourselves since last week as Mayuri's fight with Pernida finishes up in the manga before Kyoraku's battle even begins. But also we are dropping back even more than that as the anime teases the start of the Friend Saga at last. How exactly is the Friend Saga going to play out? Well, we'll have to see. There's room here for an awful lot of new content if that's the route they choose to go down. Anyway, there's not too much else to say about this episode structurally, so let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself as we take a deeper look at episode 36. This episode opens perhaps naturally with the conclusion to episode 34, as Mayuri continues his diabolical laughter, the Jizo sitting up and exhaling after devouring Pernida. This is now the third time we've seen this scene in 3 consecutive weeks, so they are really getting their mileage out of it. It's definitely a bit odd, I think, that this episode doesn't open with any kind of continuation of Kyoraku versus Leal. I mean, what exactly is the structure that they are going for here? Last time they teased Pernida's return, but this time there's no mention of Leal's survival whatsoever. As I said in my last review, I think switching back and forth between the fights actually does work better like this, when you don't immediately reveal the villain is still alive, but it's just odd when they've already established a precedent. I do love the way Mayuri immediately stops laughing and just gets down to business. There's something oddly funny about it. As chapter 640 continues, the episode immediately contradicts my review from last week by restoring a line that was removed from the previous episode, as Mayuri talks with Ashisogi Jizo about having him created without any teeth, so as not to chew up Pernida, therefore enabling it to multiply. Suddenly, as we return to the scene from last week's episode, Ashisogi Jizo swells violently, numerous bulges pummeling the creature from the inside. The giant golden Jizo inflates and explodes, flooding the surrounding area in a torrent of bright yellow liquid. In a nice little action sequence, Mayuri darts backwards to avoid the wave as huge chunks of dripping flesh drop to the ground, when suddenly an arrow bursts out of the flesh itself, Mayuri narrowly avoiding the strike by backflipping in the air. The arrow slams into a tower behind the captain as Pernida rises from the ruined remains of the Jizo covered in grime and gristle. The enormous hand is clutching a Quincy's bow between its fingers and it shrieks with a manic laughter. Pernida's laughter sounds perfect here. It's wild, it's a cheeky, almost childlike cackle as it attempts to mimic Mayuri's own glee from earlier. As we look down upon the scene, the floor of Yhwach's pristine new nation is covered in chunks of bloody, oozing flesh. This might be one of the most brutally visceral episodes of the arc, which of course is absolutely fitting. As Pernida looms over Mayuri, the left arm reminds the captain that he's a Quincy, therefore he can kill his enemies with a bow and arrow. However, chuckling to himself, Mayuri proclaims that he didn't forget. Instead, he simply wasn't expecting the Soul King's left arm to so shamelessly claim itself to be a Quincy. As Pernida regrows its missing fingers in a shot that actually looks really good, the Sternritter wonders why calling itself a Quincy is considered shameless. While doing so, its voice changes again, deepening even further this time. There's no doubt in my mind that Pernida is handled much better this time around. It's no longer swaying, it's no longer screaming, and it actually looks pretty good most of the time. This is a much more fitting portrayal for the character and actually restores some of its threatening aura from the manga. As Pernida's voice changes back, it comments that it's sick of Mayuri's endlessly bad-mouthing the Quincy's. But Mayuri's mind is elsewhere. What exactly is going on with the creature? Its vocabulary has been steadily improving over the course of the battle, but a moment ago, when its voice deepened dramatically, it was almost as though it took on an entirely new persona. Mayuri wonders then if the arm is perhaps regaining its memory as the Soul King, or if it's maybe somehow evolving. There's no time for that though, as Pernida rises up and conjures smaller bows atop each fingertip, proceeding to blast Mayuri with a massive volley of arrows. As Mayuri swiftly ducks out of the way, he notices the arrows are connected now to Pernida's nerves. Dodging more arrows, Mayuri attempts to evade another one, only to realise the arrow's nerves have latched onto his arm. Desperate, Mayuri detonates his own arm, but the arrow continues onwards, Pernida's nerves reaching up from the ground to bend the arrow back in Mayuri's oncoming direction. Already you're seeing why the second half of this fight is something special. Mayuri is thrown into a physical arena with an opponent that can essentially control the entire battlefield, and Kubo made sure to make the absolute most of that. Mayuri has already been injured more in this fight than in both his battle with Szayelaporro and Giselle combined, and it's only going to ramp up from here. As he sails helplessly towards the arrow, Mayuri concedes that there is nothing he can do. This one is going to hit him when Nemu suddenly leaps into the fray. Reaching out, she grabs the oncoming arrow and dives past Mayuri, slicing off her arm before falling to the ground below where a net of nerves awaits her. There's a couple of little details to discuss here. Again, I like Kubo making use of the fact that Shinigami can't currently create footholds in Varvelt as Nemu falls helplessly from the sky. Pernida is an enemy who actually makes good use of that restriction too, covering almost the entire ground in a web of nerves. But secondly, Nemu cuts off her own arm immediately upon grabbing the arrow, likely due to the threat of it being connected to a nerve, except in both the anime and the manga, the arrow is clearly not connected to anything at this point, so it kind of feels like she cut her arm off for no reason. As Nemu falls, Mayuri quickly lands before taking off again, snatching his vice captain out of the air just as the nerves reach her. Although much harder to see in the anime, Mayuri grabs her by the hair as he escapes with her before tossing her to safety like a ragdoll. As Mayuri berates Nemu for intervening in the fight without being ordered to, she notes that she determined on her own that Mayuri might need a shield in this battle. Again, both the anime and the manga have been building to this moment since the fight began, with Nemu keeping a watchful eye on Mayuri from the beginning, and perhaps even going so far as to show some concern for his safety. As Mayuri says that he doesn't recall ever teaching Nemu to come to his aid at her own discretion, Nemu confirms that no, he never taught her that. Mayuri asks Nemu if she's saying then that she learned something on her own, but she doesn't know. Perhaps coming to a realization on his own, Mayuri turns away from her before proceeding to refer to her by a name that perhaps she hasn't heard for a very long time, Nemuri number 7, which shocks her. Musing that the two of them have been involved in a great number of fights since the arrival of Ichigo's group into their lives, Mayuri wonders if he's perhaps taught Nemu too much over the years. Clearly scared of something happening to her if she acts too recklessly, Mayuri asks Nemu if she realises the toll it will take on him to develop the next Nemu into what she has managed to become now. When she again notes that she doesn't know, Mayuri explodes into a rage, barking at Nemu that then she doesn't have the freedom to die by her own judgment, and she'll only die when he orders her to. Of course, this is Mayuri's own twisted way of caring for Nemu. Although he maintains absolute control over her and she appears little more than another weapon in his arsenal for him to wield, there's no denying that Mayuri sees something in Nemu. Whether it's truly love or not is honestly impossible to discern. Although technically his daughter, it's hard to know if Mayuri really feels any real compassion, any real familial attachment for Nemu because of who she is and what she's become, or for the sheer fact that he created her, and therefore he managed to achieve something special. Mayuri's character has definitely been redefined since his introduction in the Soul Society arc. Anyone with eyes can see that. Mayuri used to brutally beat and savage Nemu, treating her like less than a human at almost every opportunity, even going so far as to concoct a plan that directly involved slashing her. This Mayuri would never do that. You could argue that it's character development on display, except neither Mayuri nor Nemu have really undergone the requisite developments themselves to reach that point naturally. Instead, they simply show up again in the Rankar arc as a changed duo. Oh sure, while the fundamentals are the same, Mayuri is much less of a total monster and more of a slightly dubious one now. As seen from his soul bombs that he employs as recently as in this fight, Mayuri is still a twisted maniac, but it's his attitude to Nemu that's crucially been completely reworked. And to be honest, this version of Mayuri is ultimately more interesting. Sure, I love the madman that Uryu fights in the Soul Society arc too, and for the villainous role the Gote 13 plays in some aspects of that arc, I think that version of Mayuri absolutely works. But it is interesting to see the two of them like this here in the 1000-Year Blood War arc at the very end of their journey. It also makes some of the flashbacks feel a little dissonant. Mayuri is shown being overtly fatherly towards Nemu as she grows up, but we know in the Soul Society arc that he ruthlessly abuses her to the point of sadism. These two versions of Mayuri simply don't really mesh. The fatherly Mayuri that we see in the upcoming flashbacks is far more akin to this Mayuri that we have here in the current fight. If you carved out the Mayuri from the Soul Society arc, I think you would have a much neater character journey for the captain that makes a lot more sense. Anyway, we then find ourselves at the start of chapter 640, where Nemu opens her eyes for the very first time. It's a nice moment, and here in the anime we actually get to see Mayuri too, which is cool. In the opening, this time, Leal is now in his Quincy Volston dish, which is an awesome detail. I do wonder what the team will do about Askin and Gerard, if anything. Maybe there will be something similar in opening 4, because otherwise they just aren't going to change before the end of the cour at this rate. After the opening, we begin chapter 641 as Nemu hands Mayuri a Hoji Kuzai, which she notes he didn't collect from the medicine cabinet like he normally does before a battle. Clearly, Mayuri was way too preoccupied with everything going on and perhaps too eager to get out into the field to remember his usually vigorous preparations. Mayuri applies the Hoji Kuzai to himself, restoring his destroyed arm before handing it back to Nemu to use on herself, the two of them regrowing their missing arms. Anyway, as Pernida rises up in front of the two of them, Mayuri leaps back into battle once more, again showing signs of that keenness that does border on being reckless. Activating his Herenkyaku boots, Mayuri soars through the air, zipping and speeding around to avoid Pernida's arrows. The other two arms return to the fight as well, each of them also blasting Mayuri with arrows. Honestly, this is such an absurd amount of arrows, it doesn't really make sense that Mayuri avoids every single one of them, but there you go. I mean, he manages it in the manga too, so he's clearly insanely fast with these rocket boots of his. There are a couple of close calls here in the anime as one arrow almost grazes his face, but Mayuri dives out of the way in time. It's here that Mayuri begins to enact his master plan. As he soars through the air, he's constantly releasing a highly concentrated anesthetic in the form of a gas that can neutralize Pernida's arrows, dropping them to the ground and disabling the nerves. From here, Nemu's job is to inject a disabled arrow with a coagulating agent that will then course through the nerves connected to Pernida's body and coagulate the blood inside Pernida itself, essentially freezing Pernida to death from the inside by solidifying its own blood. There are a couple of interesting points to consider about this sequence. Again, I love how it's depicted here in the anime. Some of the shots of Mayuri flying about are really dynamic and well implemented, such as Mayuri skidding towards the camera before bolting upwards again to avoid the continuous rain of arrows. The only thing I slightly miss is the more sinister feeling in the manga that Pernida is still a step ahead of Mayuri, really no matter what he tries. Here in the anime, the other two arms are just there, also firing arrows, but in the manga there is a really cool couple of shots where Mayuri kind of turns, looking over his shoulder to realise the other two arms are also rising slowly in a very creepy fashion. That is kind of lost here, but apart from that, the actual execution of this scene is handled very well. It's interesting that Mayuri specifically notes that he is being affected by the anesthetic a bit as well. He says the same thing in the manga, and I wonder if we're meant to think that's why he can't get out of the way of Pernida's attack later on, but it's never brought up again, so it's a little bit odd. However, I also love seeing Mayuri and Nemu really working as a team here out on the battlefield, and their plan nearly succeeds. Nemu lands on the nullified nerves and injects one of the still active arrows with the coagulating agent, sending the agent through the nerve and into Pernida itself. The first hand immediately begins to freeze in place, its body killed by the agent. The second hand follows suit, turning a deep shade of purple as the blood solidifies inside it. However, the final hand catches sight of what's going on just in time. As Mayuri declares victory with a mad grin on his face, he's shocked as Pernida dramatically tears off its own thumb as it begins to freeze, saving itself at the last second. Don't ask me how it manages to remove its own thumb like that, but it's a really cool scene and probably one of my favourite sequences from the entire fight. It's awesome to see Mayuri come up with a plan like this in the midst of battle, and for it to come so close to succeeding but failing at the last hurdle. Considering we're so used to Mayuri's efforts working flawlessly, this is the kind of change of pace that defines this battle. In another nice showcase of attention to detail, the severed thumb can't become a new Pernida hand because the coagulating agent has already killed it, which I think is really cool. As Pernida turns to Mayuri and asks if he really thinks that he can kill him with something like this, Mayuri realises that the hand now almost sounds like Kenpachi. To be honest, when I read the manga initially, I thought it would actually have Kenpachi's voice, but this probably does make more sense. I think it's just supposed to be its overall tone. As Mayuri at last realises that Pernida is evolving by assimilating data from everything its nerves touch, he suddenly realises that Nemu's reaction speeds will no longer be enough to keep up. Twisting on the spot, Mayuri roars at Nemu to back away. However, as we reach the end of chapter 641, Pernida's main body sheds the coagulation thanks to the learned ability of Mayuri's Matai Fukuin Shotai and emerges behind the captain, ready to grab and kill him. As Nemu prepares to dive back into the battle in order to rescue Mayuri, the episode transitions away into a flashback, taking us to some of Nemu's earliest days. Obviously, I'm happy with the amount of love Akon is shown here in the flashback, but I really like the little detail that he is who Nemu chooses to go to with her concerns regarding Mayuri, no longer calling her by her full official name. Returning briefly to the present day, we see Akon, Kuna, and the unnamed scientist with the bandaged head busily attempting to get the laboratory sorted in time for the captain's return from the battle. Kuna accidentally stumbles upon the remains of Nemuri attempts 1 through 3, stored in glass canisters. Akon explains to them that in the beginning, they suffered failure after failure, but with attempt number 4, they were finally able to create a brain, even though it didn't progress any further from there. The bandaged scientist wonders if this is the technology they used to fix his head, which Akon confirms. Honestly, this character is really weird. I mean, there's no context for his appearance or who he even is. He's been around, really, since the earliest days of the R&D department in the story, but we've never known anything about him. I'm not sure anyone's really had any desire to know anything about him either, but there you go. It seems odd that Kubo even drew attention to this in the first place, but there's a piece of lore for you, bandaged head scientist, I guess. Anyway, Akon continues, explaining that with attempt number 5, they were able to reach the fetus stage, which Mayuri then used to modify his Zanpakuto, enabling him to become captain. Interestingly, the anime slightly changes Kuna's reaction to this news. In the manga, she actively thinks about the appearance of Mayuri's bankai and looks uneasy about this revelation, whereas here in the episode, she doesn't seem to really give it that much thought. Attempt number 6 managed to reach 2 years old before dying once its cell division stopped, so when attempt number 7 outlived that age, Mayuri was supposedly overjoyed. Back in the fight, Nemu charges her full strength and explodes into action, taking off like a rocket as she screams towards Mayuri in a desperate attempt to save his life. As the anime takes us back into the past once more, Akon and Nemu continue to talk, with Nemu pestering Akon about why Mayuri no longer calls her by her full name. Akon wonders if maybe Mayuri is embarrassed, to which Nemu states that she can't imagine Mayuri feeling such a way. As Akon explains Mayuri's personal dream of creating an artificial Shinigami from nothing, the anime shows us a few shots of Nemu's life growing up. Interestingly, the anime makes it look like an idyllic childhood, save for the contrast of the cold, lifeless, mechanical contraptions around her at all times, but I have to wonder if Mayuri didn't ruthlessly put her through hell at some points, whether that was intense training or attempting to improve her further. As I noted in my reaction, I think the toy she's sleeping with as a child is in fact one of the surveillance bugs the 12th Division has set up all around the lab. But Akon continues on, noting that for every waking hour Nemu exists, for as long as she continues to grow, to eat, to sleep, to breathe, Mayuri is living within a dream. His dream of seeing the Nemuri project come to fruition at long last, unfolding before his eyes. As he turns to Nemu with an almost uncharacteristic smile on his face, Akon states that Nemu is the captain's greatest creation, his masterpiece, and that there's no way she wouldn't continue to evolve beyond their wildest dreams. It's an effective sequence, carried out beat for beat identically to the manga, as is most of the episode, and it finally sheds some light on one of Bleach's more reserved supporting characters. But as we return to the fight once more, we get to see the absolute pinnacle of that evolution hinted at by Akon all those years ago, as Nemu grabs Mayuri and obliterates Pernida with sheer force, destroying the hand as she rescues her father from the clutches of death. I've made an entire video about how absurdly strong Nemu must be at this point in time. I do think it goes overlooked. Although she can only maintain this power for a brief period as her body breaks down under the strain, Nemu is currently, arguably, top-tier captain level. She's capable of completely destroying, not just killing, but utterly atomizing Pernida with her sheer velocity and force alone. As she carries Mayuri away from harm, Nemu explains to him how she acquired such strength. Of course, it's the power that he bestowed upon her, and she's extracting almost everything her body can possibly output to demonstrate her ability to protect him. Showcasing her own autonomy for perhaps the first time ever, save for maybe when she offers Uryu the antidote to Mayuri's poison in the Soul Society arc. Nemu rebuffs Mayuri's claim that her mission is solely to grow. Instead, she circumvents it, claiming to be able to show him her growth by protecting him, which in her eyes is her true mission, while in Mayuri's eyes he's surprised that she's learned to talk back in such a way. Nemu places Mayuri lightly down on a rooftop. This is executed differently compared to the manga and makes a lot more sense. In the original chapter, Nemu kind of just launches Mayuri downwards, which is odd considering she's supposed to be concerned for his safety. Here, she shows a lot more care for him in the way she puts him down before blasting off again to face down the final Pernida arm, the one that severed its own thumb. Since then, the thumb has regrown. You don't see its thumb regrowing in the anime, but in the manga the regeneration process is clearly underway as Nemu launches herself at the arm. Perhaps the only issue I have left with how Pernida looks here in the anime is how skinny the arms are. The wrists are absolutely tiny for some reason, where in the manga, its proportions look like they make a bit more sense to me. But as Mayuri comments that the time has finally come for him to leave a battle in Nemu's hands, he notes it's humiliating, but he says so with a wry smile on his face. Nemu charges Pernida and the two come together for one final clash. As Nemu approaches the Soul King's left arm, she lifts her own arm back and begins to ready her ultimate attack, Gikon Jurinju, a blast generated by shaving away 6% of her own soul. It's kind of crazy that only 6% of her soul is enough to totally annihilate Pernida's entire body, but there you go. This entire sequence looks absolutely wonderful here in the anime. As we arrive at the cliffhanger of chapter 642, a brilliant yellow light envelops Nemu's arm, a striking crosshair appearing on her eyes as she readies her cannon, the light illuminating the entire battlefield. Firing the blast from her hand, generating power from her own soul itself, Nemu launches Gikon Jorinju, sending the orb of energy into Pernida's eye. The power is so vast and dense that it forces Pernida's eye apart without actually destroying it, essentially creating a pathway through Pernida itself, pushing the hand's iris to the side as it barrels on through. With a calamitous boom, the energy ball tears through Pernida's hand, shattering it to pieces while sending a streak of energy running down the arm itself, carving through it with a boiling hot shard of light. As Nemu falls backwards, exhausted Pernida is splintered in two, the entire hand reduced to fleshy chunks that sail listlessly through the sky. The battle is won. I really like the anime's new angle of Nemu falling backwards while Pernida collapses in front of her. It's really cool and shows the full scale, the full extent of their showdown well. Mayuri watches speechless from the sidelines as his masterpiece drops through the air like a stone, a content look on Nemu's face. The music that plays here, of course, is very fitting. The soft tune as Nemu falls initially lulls you into a false sense of security. Could it really be as easy as that? Did Nemu succeed? Of course, we know that's not the case. As the vocal track continues to play unabated, Nemu is suddenly surrounded by falling chunks of Pernida, all of which suddenly come alive, eyeballs sprouting from every possible place, including from underneath a fingernail, the image of which sticks out to me to this day. With Nemu completely helpless and at Pernida's mercy, Mayuri can only watch as she's viciously impaled by numerous nerves which stab through her like knives. Honestly, it feels way more gruesome than the manga on multiple fronts. Although the manga has the added benefit of the medium it's in, you can turn the page and immediately see that Nemu is in massive trouble for that added effectiveness. Here in the anime, we actually see several of the nerves run her through, blood bursting from her as she opens her mouth in shock. I liked how in the manga she had her mouth open as though she was screaming, but it was completely silent. There's definitely an added creepiness to that. However, the anime compensates by covering Nemu in vine-like nerves before her body swells and ruptures, every inch of her inflating before Pernida pulls her apart in a devastating explosion, bursting her body like a balloon and showering the battlefield with blood. To be honest, I'm not really sure why Nemu suddenly swells up like that, but it makes for a cool, grisly visual and adds to the impact of the scene, again using the medium in an effective way. As blood splashes across the ground around Mayuri, Pernida begins to reform itself, pulling its entire hand back together again. And again, this is kind of interesting to me. Why don't these individual Pernida chunks create essentially a new army of Pernidas? Why do they all restore one single arm? But Mayuri isn't paying attention to that. Instead, all he can think of is Nemu. For a moment, we are privy to the most human Mayuri has ever felt. As he doubles over, barely able to stand, he's suddenly greeted by a most surprising and despicable figure. The face of Szayelaporro Granz engulfs Mayuri's entire mind as he appears behind the despondent captain, a sinister smirk lacing his lips. And wow, does the anime make Szayelaporro look absolutely amazing here. I love the pink hue that he's doused in while he's drawn totally impeccably to boot. In many ways, this feels like a fitting punishment for Mayuri. In his moment of true despair, in his purgatory, the only face to greet him is the mocking leer of a former enemy, the two of them sealed off from the world by a crushing, all-enveloping darkness. Mayuri will find no comfort here, no solace. Instead, Szayelaporro kicks the scientist while he's down, his gloating voice filled with glee as he throws Mayuri's words from their battle back at him. Had Mayuri really begun to see Nemu as perfect after all this time? Had he become that which he so despised? In his battle with the 8th Espada, Mayuri had espoused at great length the belief that for men of science, perfection should be detested, for it's a dead end. And yet, right under his nose, Mayuri had found what he believed to be perfect all along. Nemu had become that for him. And this has always been very interesting to me because it feels like there's a juxtaposition happening here that we can't overlook. It would be naive, I think, to mistake Mayuri's sadness in this moment for humanity. Is he sad because his daughter died? Or is he sad because his perfect experiment, his perfect toy, was broken? Honestly, his response to Szayelaporro's torment seems to indicate that it's the latter, as Szayelaporro tells Mayuri to thank this monstrous left arm for killing what he deemed to be perfect, thereby giving him a chance to now build something even better. Mayuri reaches out and dispels Szayelaporro in an instant, crushing him into nothing and cutting the song at the same time in a nice detail. And I do think the anime handles all of this marvellously. Firstly, as I said a minute ago, Szayelaporro really does look fantastic here. Shots like these are so unbelievably good, and of course his voice actor does a wonderful job in recapturing the Espada's pomposity and arrogance. Maybe we'll hear him again someday, if you know what I mean. But I love that the soft, sweet, vocal track that plays in the twilight of Nemu's life feels as though it's meant to represent a surfacing of Mayuri's long-lost humanity, and yet with Szayelaporro's urging, Mayuri quashes it once more, repressing it, swatting it down, and ending the song and that imagery in one fell swoop. So, what can we take away from this moment? What has Mayuri learned, if anything? Or perhaps his only takeaway is that Nemu wasn't perfect after all, and he was a fool for considering her so. As a scientist of his ilk, the relentless pursuit of progression is the only path forward. I'll be honest, I don't think he's particularly saddened by Nemu's death, as we'll see later, though the anime definitely does a little more, I think, than the manga to make us think that, at the very least, he does feel something towards her. But with Mayuri having returned to his senses, the monstrous form of Pernida comes crashing down beside him, and oh boy, the finale of this battle is handled incredibly. Pernida, having mostly reconstituted itself, has now become a true abomination. A malformed maelstrom of monstrous mass, the eye on its palm having now been removed, opening up to reveal a mouth from which a gigantic tongue extends. Where it should have teeth, Pernida now has eyes, and eyes are peppered all over its fingers too. I mean, Kubo, of course, is famous for and absolutely loves his body horror, and that's exactly what Pernida has now become. But the anime goes absolutely crazy here, way harder than it had any need to, firing up the best soundtrack of the episode as Pernida begins to lick up Nemu's gory remains. It also hacks up a disgusting, wheezing, breathing noise as it approaches the captain, as though it is breathing from a mouth for the first time, dragging itself along the building like an animal as it feeds. Of course, Pernida learned this from the golden Ashisogi Jizo, which devoured it initially, so now it's here to consume its defeated foe in a similar manner. Interestingly, in the manga, there's actually more than one hand here in this scene, as multiple Pernida arrive to eat Nemu. And actually, this feels like the correct interpretation to me. I assume this is meant to be the newly formed Pernida that resulted from the explosion I mentioned a moment ago, but there is no sign of an additional hand here in the anime. Anyway, Mayuri clips something into the side of his head. While he does do this in the manga too, it is made much more visible here, and proceeds to swipe Nemu's brain back from Pernida's tongue. As the hand attempts to attack him, Mayuri seemingly activates whatever this new attachment is and electrocutes Pernida, zapping the hand into paralysis. I have to wonder why he didn't just use this from the beginning, and my only theory relating to that is that perhaps this is something that Mayuri used to use to punish Nemu. And it now only works on Pernida because the hand is devouring her, but I mean, that is only speculation. But with Nemu's brain now in his possession, a battered Mayuri tells Pernida to finish eating her up. though he'll likely die before he gets the chance. And suddenly Pernida's entire body stiffens and the giant arm wonders what's going on. Its tongue, its eyeballs, its fingers, everything begins to rapidly swell and bubble in a grotesque fashion, the monstrosity squirming as its very form is slowly engorged. Again, the anime adds to the horror of this scene, showing blood spraying from several different parts of Pernida as its skin can no longer contain its mass, the hand barely recognisable. Its eye almost lost within the twisting, warping, ballooning mounds of flesh. You can just about make out Pernida's suffocated screams as a truly terrifying orchestral track blares over the top. It is maddening, but excellent stuff. Mayuri explains to Pernida in a way that even an idiot can understand that Pernida has ingested a special organ that was implanted within Nemu to help her cells continue growing and multiplying beyond the 2-year limit that they found with attempt number 6. The organ is active at all times to prevent Nemu from regressing, from breaking down, and only her brain keeps it in check. Having snatched the brain away from Pernida, Mayuri reveals that without it, Pernida's body will undergo unlimited multiplication and growth. With one final agonising scream, Pernida explodes, the entire hand blasted to pieces, sending crimson chunks of sinewy flesh splattering across the battlefield. With the hand gone, leaving only a hunk of bloody mass at its wrist, Pernida collapses backwards. God is dead, and at last the battle is over for good. Now, the anime changes this somewhat from the manga. In the manga, we see that Pernida attempts to reform from even the smallest chunks that are sent flying by the blast, as you would expect. However, even they are subject to Nemu's accelerated growth, as Pernida itself has devoured that organ, and so they too explode violently, surrounding Mayuri in a series of blasts as Pernida, every last piece of Pernida that ever will be, that ever is, that ever was, is destroyed once and for all. Essentially saying that even after these pieces have exploded likely into more pieces, they too will also grow indefinitely, they too will explode until there is nothing left at all. In the anime though, Pernida doesn't reform after its hand is blown to pieces, which doesn't really make sense, as we've seen it should come back no matter what. It's thanks to the opening of chapter 644 that we know there is no chance for Pernida to return whatsoever, and that has been removed from the anime. In some ways, I appreciate the newfound simplicity of Pernida's destruction here in the episode. It does feel very final, it's a statement move, but it does conflict with what we've seen the Sternritter to be capable of. Mayuri walks away from the site of the battle, clutching Nemu's brain by his side. However, Pernida has the last laugh, as a functioning nerve was able to ensnare Mayuri's legs and destroy them, leaving the scientist crumpled on the ground. As he notes, he now finds himself in the same position as Zaraki. From the darkness of the alley ahead, Mayuri is surprised to see Ikkaku and Yumechika approach him. Again, unfortunately, there is just no sign of Hanataro whatsoever, so he's once again inexplicably missing. I really feel like it's a small point, but with the benefit of hindsight that the anime is working with, things like this shouldn't happen, especially since they have made such a concerted effort to account for everyone in the Gotei 13's group of characters so far, but there you go. On Mayuri's orders, Ikkaku and Yumechika help him to his restoration pods, which again have inexplicably appeared here in Varvelt. From inside them, Hitsugaya and Matsumoto emerge, having been de-zombified after their battle with Giselle. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be any sign of Rose and Kensei, which is not only a big shame, but also doesn't really make sense. It didn't make sense in the manga, and it doesn't make sense here. Mayuri has 4 pods, so why not heal all 4 of them for use in the battle to come? The 2 sealed pods behind Hitsugaya and Matsumoto likely do house Rose and Kensei, so why can't they join the fight? Those sealed pods are in the manga too, by the way, but interestingly there, they actually open up to reveal no one inside. Perhaps the Vizard are actually in them in the anime, since they haven't actually opened up yet. I doubt it, but I can hold out hope. It's been a surprisingly long time, by the way, since we last saw Hitsugaya. I think it was episode 23, and the same goes for Matsumoto. Now again, here in the manga, Matsumoto completely vanishes from the final battle entirely. I'm hoping she might actually be given something to do here in the anime. But as Mayuri instructs Ikkaku and Yumachika to place both him and Zaraki in the restoration pods, Hitsugaya thanks the scientist for saving his life. It's a moment of humility, I think, for really everyone involved, and as the lid closes on a bloodied and beaten Mayuri, both Ikkaku and Yumachika bow before him, also thanking him for saving Zaraki's life. This is another huge moment for Mayuri, and his contributions to the war effort are being recognised by people he wouldn't normally help in any way, shape or form. Even though the idea of them thanking him annoys him, the thanks are tangible proof of what he has done for people here, and it goes a long way to helping humanise him even further. But as the pod's door closes on him, Mayuri is sealed away with his thoughts. He reveals that he's smuggled Nemu's brain inside his shahakusho, and he's ecstatic at the fact that he's finally created a soul that's capable of evolving on its own. See, it's this moment here that makes me think that Mayuri isn't particularly sad about Nemu herself actually dying, more that she, as a product of his, was destroyed. He's now very excited about the possibility of what's next to come. At long last, though, he has surpassed Urahara. Of course, Mayuri is presumably unaware of Ururu's existence. That might really tip him over the edge, to be honest. But as his eyes close and he passes out, the restoration pods fill with water. Interestingly, Mayuri's feet are now facing the correct direction here, despite having been snapped and twisted round entirely, but the episode comes to an end in a very nice but somber way, with the image of Mayuri in the watery depths, sinking into slumber as the almost heavenly visage of Nemu reaches out to him from above. And here is the opposite of what I just said, the other side of the coin that does continue to humanise Mayuri. It does appear that Nemu is perhaps the last thing he thought of before falling unconscious. Honestly, it's a very effective end to one of the Thousand Year Blood War arc's best fights. Mayuri and Nemu are now out of the battle, and this is likely the final time we'll actually see Mayuri before the epilogue, unless something major changes later on. But the episode isn't over yet. In fact, we have a brand new scene to examine after the credits, as the Friend saga finally begins at last. We find ourselves inside the main fortress of Varvelt itself. Interestingly, the lighting here is mostly back to normal thanks to the blue flame torches lining the walls. Both Lil Toto and Giselle have made it into the palace, with Giselle musing that Yhwach even brought the arena up with him. I'm not entirely sure what this is a reference to. Is the arena supposed to be a location we recognise? It seems odd to single it out otherwise. I'm not sure, but it sounds suited to a battle, which is a good thing. Suddenly a battalion of Soldat appear on the scene, and Lil Toto remarks that Yhwach is giving them a warm welcome. At this, Giselle calls for the rest of the girls to arrive. In a truly surprising moment, the zombified Bambietta returns, but even crazier than that is the arrival of Candice and Meninas, both of who are also zombified now. With the Bambis now back together once again, we have to ask the question, what's going on here? How did Giselle manage to zombify Candice and Meninas? Well, let's take a look at the possibilities. The last time we saw Candice and Meninas in the anime was episode 25. The two of them were struck by Yhwach's Valen, presumably robbing them of their holy forms. Now, the question is, were they killed by the Valen or not? Both of them were injured prior to being struck by the column of light, so that would have made them more susceptible to it, but considering Nanana survived a direct hit, I do find it somewhat hard to believe. In fact, it's turning out that perhaps the only Sternritter to be killed by the Valen was Robert after all, and his death happened off-screen here in the anime, which makes things even weirder. The other possibility is that Giselle went and found them, likely weakened by the Valen, and murdered them in order to zombify them. This is possible, I mean there's a precedent for it, but the timescale is definitely weird. We know that Giselle was with Lil Toto and Bambietta when the Alsvalen struck, which means if she was going to go and kill and zombify Candice and Meninas, she'd have to do so before she, Lil Toto and Bazz-B confronted the Gote 13 and then switched sides. I guess that's totally possible, but then that would mean Lil Toto was likely in on it, unless Giselle split off from her for some reason during that time. However, when Lil Toto sees the girls gathered together, she seems surprised that Giselle had them tag along with the city when it was lifted into the sky, which makes me wonder if she had any idea at all that they'd been zombified. There's also the question of where were the zombified Candice, Meninas and Bambietta when these three turncoat Sternritter confronted the Gote 13. Giselle brings an entire army of Shinigami with her, but forgets to bring the three powerful Sternritter zombies she has? Another weird thing about this is that Bambietta is seemingly back to how she was during the battle with Mayuri. Not in a great place at all by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly better than the last time we saw her. The last time we saw her, Giselle was beating her to death once again in order to take back the blood that she gave her, restoring the injuries that she herself suffered at the hands of Kensei. So, does this mean Giselle took back her blood from Bambietta, leaving her essentially lifeless again, and then almost immediately gave it back? I guess it's possible, it just seems a little bit weird to me. Then there's the question of Candice and Meninas. What's going on with them? Unlike Bambietta, they are now kitted out with these strange, glittering skull emblems. Meninas has a pair on her shoulders, while Candice has a pair on her ankles. They both have a pair of shimmering devil horns now, and bear what looks like fire on their arms and legs. While depicted in a similar fashion to Quincy Volstendish, this isn't that. These characters lost their Volstendish after being struck by Alsvalen, so this is something completely new. It kind of looks like the iconography of Giselle's Dancing Dead Boys Club power, but again it's hard to say. Either way, this explains why Candice's lightning isn't green, as she isn't in Volstendish, but why doesn't Bambietta have these new elements too? This also confirms what the mysterious skull emblem meant on both Candice and Meninas' death arts that Kubo drew them back in episode 25. They were being zombified, which I think is a theory that many people had. This does also make me wonder about Can't Fear Your Own World, though that's perhaps something we'll go into in another video. But in Can't Fear Your Own World, Candice and Meninas, I believe off the top of my head, aren't zombies, but they are instead working for Mayuri. So this seems to contradict that, but again, we'll actually see where this goes. That could still end up happening, I guess. Anyway, with them all together now, it definitely makes a little more sense that they would think they could take on Yhwach, even if they still don't stand a chance. Together, though, they take the fight to the Soldat, exploding, punching, zapping, and even eating their enemies. The Soldat don't seem to be a match for the Sternritter until something very peculiar happens. With their masks and hats removed, the Soldat's true faces are revealed, and there is nothing human about these Quincy. Instead, they are made of a black, goopy Reiatsu, strange eyes covering their faces. Of course, this is immediately reminiscent of Yhwach's new power, or even the overflowing power of the Soul King himself. So, what's going on here? Well, most, if not all, of the Soldat were killed by Yhwach when he initiated the Alsvalen in episode 25. These are not Soldat. In my opinion, there are no living Soldat left at all. Instead, these are creations of Yhwach using his own power, simply wearing Soldat uniforms. They are shades of Soldat, brought to life by Yhwach's godly ability. This is pretty fascinating to me, and it opens up a lot of possibilities, including a theory of mine that I never thought would really have a chance of actually happening, but maybe now it does. As I've mentioned in the past, could this lead to us seeing some of the dead Sternritter perhaps resurrected in this way? Resurrected, I should say, in quotes, Sternritter shades, as it were, to give other characters someone to fight in the future. Could Chad and Ganju end up fighting Sternritter shades rather than statues, for example? I'd take an opportunity to see some of the deceased Sternritter again, even in this form. And it would be fitting for someone as supposedly divine yet bastardized as Yhwach to conjure misshapen living beings in this manner. But there's more to this than that. As we move over to the final scene of the episode, we see Haschwalth discussing Uryu with some more Soldat behind him. Haschwalth wonders why Uryu is at Ein's Ast, a new line for the anime. In the manga, the soldier who talks with Haschwalth notes that Uryu was headed towards Zwei Ast instead. This soldier, affectionately referred to as Mario Quincy, is completely removed from the anime. And I think this is by design. It never really made much sense that he was there to begin with, no offense to the guy. Mario is the only Quincy we ever see in Varvelt outside of Yhwach, Haschwalth and the Schutzstaffel. But his mere existence implies there are more living, breathing human Quincy there. But here in the anime, he is removed, replaced by these mysterious Soldat, who I'm also assuming are Soldat shades, as I'm deciding to call them now. If the Soldat following Haschwalth are indeed revealed to be these shadowy versions, then that confirms it. Outside of Yhwach and his Schutzstaffel, there is nothing else living here in Varvelt at all. Yhwach is playing at being God. He is parading a false life about the nation in a way that's truly creepy. Perhaps rather tellingly, the Soldat don't respond at all when Haschwalth orders them to leave. I wonder if next week, or wherever we continue on with this sequence, we'll see that they were creations of Yhwach's Soul King power too. However, the episode ends with the Soldat behind Haschwalth being blasted by several rapid-fire flame bullets. It's really cool, and I love how the music starts up again as they get shot. Haschwalth turns to see Bazz-B standing behind him. Unfortunately, due to Mario being cut, the anime also removed this incredibly cool and atmospheric image of Bazz-B, but that's by the by. As Haschwalth asks Bazz-B what he's doing, Bazz-B responds by smirking, saying Haschwalth should be asking how he's still alive, despite the fact that virtually every single Sternritter has apparently survived the Auswählen, possibly anyway, depending on Candice and Meninas. But that brings episode 36 to a close, roughly halfway through chapter 630 and the start of the Friends saga at last. To be honest, I think the most likely outcome is that Candice and Meninas were killed by the Auswählen, but maybe we'll find out in the future. I'm not holding out too much hope for that. However, the poem for this week features none other than Nanao, indicating that yes, as expected, next week will focus on the finale to Kyoraku vs. Leal. And having seen the official preview images that they release every week, I am very, very happy to see that Leal's second form, his owl form, looks like it's going to look fantastic, which I'm breathing a sigh of relief about. Featuring Shinken Hakyoken's handle in the image, the poem reads, "Shared memories unspoken. The mirror transmits from the shadows." It's cool. As Nanao says the word mirror, her voice echoes slightly. But this poem is, I think, pretty straightforward, basically just telling us everything that's going to happen in the remainder of the fight, from the shared flashback to, of course, Nanao taking the mirror sword as she emerges from the shadows. Interestingly, the episode is called Shadows Gone, which is the first original title of the course so far. Likely the theatre suicide was no longer applicable since Kyoraku's bankai is effectively over. But that's it for episode 36 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, titled Baby Hold Your Hand 2, Never Ending My Dream. And what a fantastic one it was, bringing to a close Mayuri and Nemu versus Pernida in a truly fitting and emotional way. We do actually have, for the first time in ages, a new addition to the Sternritter in Memoriam this week, as we say goodbye to Sternritter C, the compulsory Pernida Pankaj as the left arm of the Soul King. Bazz-B, Lil Toto and Giselle have outlived the left arm of the Soul King here in the anime, which is quite funny, and I imagine they will do so for Lil Barrow as well. I will say, and I mentioned this in my reaction as well, it is a shame that we didn't get a flashback for Pernida, as I do kind of feel like one is needed, even though Pernida's origin, I guess you could call it, was revealed in episode 24 in that new flashback. I would have liked a little bit more. So how about some predictions for next week, episode 37, titled Shadows Gone? We're not going to go crazy here because, again, I think it's actually pretty obvious what the episode is going to be. Basically, the whole thing is going to be Kyoraku and Nanao versus Leal, the second half of that fight. Now, the real question is, how is the fight going to end? I'm really kind of hoping that the battle ends in a much more conclusive way, like maybe Shinken Hakyoken straight up kills Leal, because I've always hated the Leal Flamingos. It's just not a great moment for that character, to be honest, to see him end up like that. It is cool, of course, that Izuru returns from the dead to kind of deal with the Flamingos. If the Flamingo scene does happen and Izuru appears next week, I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen just yet, to be honest. Maybe Izuru's going to appear next week, maybe he's not. I'm not entirely sure about that. But to be honest, if he does appear and they do play that scene from chapter 654, then I would really like Izuru to just kill Leal and be done with it. So again, his fate is not left up in the air. That kind of certainty is the kind of closure I would like to see the anime add. But again, I'm not sure we're going to get any of that next week. I think it will probably end, if I had to guess, I think the episode will probably end with Leal, of course, being separated in the air, his feathers falling down. Maybe we'll get the scene where Kyoraku says that they need to catch up with the rest of the Gotei 13, only for him to kind of collapse onto the ground. That might be where the episode then fades to black. And maybe we'll get another new sequence like with this week after the credits. I don't know. I'd like to, because that's honestly the most exciting part of the episode a lot of the time, because it's brand new stuff. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. But let me know your thoughts and feelings about episode 36 of the 1000 Year Blood War arc down in the comments below. I'd love to hear everything you have to say. How did you feel about Mayuri and Nemu versus Pernida this week? How did you feel about the fight as a whole in regards to how it was portrayed here in the anime? And what did you think of the exciting new scene at the end of this week's episode, showing not only the return of the Bambis, but also the appearance of these mysterious new Soldat shades? What do you think that's going to lead to? If anything, I'd love to hear thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the episode by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. If you too want to support me over on Patreon, if you like what I do here over on YouTube, you can do just that. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you'll get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and at the $2 tier or higher, you can enjoy every video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, once again, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you took some value away from this week's review, and until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.